And if I don't get any can'ts, I'll keep going. I'm not going to do introductions. Great, thank you. Good. I'm not going to do introductions on the camera, but if you could say in the chat where you're from and what your job role is, that will be really useful for us after this session. And we are recording. It's just started, I think, so hopefully this works. If you don't want to be on the recording, then do please just keep your camera and microphone off, and you can just use the chat to talk, and then there won't be any record of you here. I'm going to send you an evaluation at the end. Now I'm going to try and share my screen for a presentation, but it's going to be a bit tricky, so I'll try and make that work. While I do that, I am Dan Martin, as you can see. I'm Principal Officer for Social Care at the Council for Disabled Children, and my background is as a social worker. So let me try and see if I can share my screen. Let's do this. Okay, I'm hoping you can now see a PowerPoint presentation which says adapted approaches as the first line. If you can, please say yes in the chat. Great, okay, good. Right, we've got very limited time, so this is just a quick overview of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to run through what we know about the law, what we know about the guidance. I'm going to spend very little time on the SEND changes because I assume you are experts in that. But what I will spend a bit more time on is the amendments to children's social care law and guidance, talk about what that means in practice, then look at some tools that might be useful for practitioners in their work at the moment, thinking about both the EHC process, but also social care with disabled children more generally through the pandemic and how we might adapt to that work. So I'm going to run through those tools, give you some ideas, and then we'll have some discussion, and hopefully you'll have some questions for me, but also we can just have a chat about actually how things are working in practice and what might be useful for thinking about where we go from here. So I hope that's all okay. So this, I assume, as I say, that you know very well, so I'm going to spend really just a brief moment on it so we all got at least the same grounding in this. So you will know the Coronavirus Act of 2020 that we've just talked about and Andre has touched on briefly does include some of these temporary emergency powers which the Secretary of State has enabled for this month period. We don't yet know if they will be renewed, and they apply to Section 43, 44 and 42 of the Children and Families Act of 2014. You will have seen this, I know, so this is probably all nothing new to you, I hope. This is about 43 and 44, the sections. This is section 42, about reasonable endeavours. And I'm just whizzing through this because I assume this is all fairly familiar to you. This is just some thoughts on what might be a reasonable endeavour, which is the language used as the powers are modified. So it's relatively low legal bar, can't have blanket policies, should be about the individual child and their needs and conversations between the local authority, parent, children, young people. And there should be a record of how decisions have been made about any adaptations to planning. And this is about individual decisions. There shouldn't be blanket policies. It's whatever is best and possible for the individual child at that time. Now, this obviously is about children with special educational needs on the whole, but clearly it does have some implications for social care with these children. This is just some notes on what you might want to consider in terms of thinking about using the relaxations and adapting provision given the current circumstances. This is from DFE, so just some suggestions there. And this is about the timescale changes. So there have been some relaxations to timescales, as you all know, but not around some areas, particularly around requesting assessments. And this is just some more detail on timescale, and you'll know that they can only be used where provision has been affected by coronavirus. And as it says there, 15 days for parents to give views has remained, as has that limit for settings to respond to proposal for provision to be named. Now that is just so we all know what we're talking about in terms of changes to the law around SEND, education, health and care plans. And I know that's really quick, but I'm assuming you all know that. And actually, I don't want to spend too much time on that because I think there's some more interesting questions around the specific guidance on social care law. So as you can see, much of the law hasn't changed. There are lots that remains exactly the same, and the changes don't apply to deadlines that should have been reached before May the 1st, as you all know. Again, I assume. Now this is, I think, what's slightly more interesting. There have been, I think, lots of questions about the changes to children's social care law, and these changes that fall under the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendment Regulations came into force only a day after they were released. So there wasn't much time for people to understand the law itself, what the new regulations changed and the implications for practice. So these regs, as I assume you will know, amend 10 existing pieces of regulation, expire, unlike the Coronavirus Act, on the 25th of September, but they may be renewed. And again, we have no indication at the moment of how long the Department for Education expects these changes to last for, whether they will be extended after the 25th of September or not. And there are some really significant changes around visiting looked after children. So the duty to visit has been relaxed and can now be as soon as is reasonably practicable. What would have been the third review of looked after children's plans, where it would have been 6 monthly, that they can now be held where reasonably practical. There's a significant change around short breaks, which I assume you will know, where they've removed the 17-day requirement. So if a disabled child had access to short break for a period of 17 days or longer, then they would have become looked after. That no longer needs to be the case, although the rule about them taking a short break for 75 days in a year still applies. Temporary foster placements, as it says here, can now be up to 24 weeks, and they don't need to be someone who was connected to the child. So they've removed that requirement that the temporary foster carer is connected to the child. That's basically to free up capacity, because there's a real fear, and some of you will have seen the news today from Bernardo's, that they've had a massive surge in requests for foster placements. There was a real fear that there would be a shortage of foster placements, so that's to help with that. Private fostering, so where a child is placed with a friend, say, under a private arrangement, the initial visit only needs to be as soon as is reasonably practicable, whereas before it was within 7 working days. The Coronavirus Act 2020 applies now to children in children's homes, and they can be deprived of their liberty where there's a risk of infection and where that is approved by a public health official. And there are relaxations to fostering and adoption panels. So particularly in terms of adoption panels, there's no longer a requirement to hold an adoption panel before an adoption placement is approved. So there may not be the same level of checks and balances on adoption decision making. So that's what the law now says. So the law introduces significant relaxations to local authorities' duties towards a group of children, particularly those who are looked after, but also some disabled children and children in fostering. But there is also this social care guidance which sits alongside those regulations and offers some advice and direction to you and practitioners and commissioners about how to use the new regulations, and also some options for working in current circumstances. Now, we anticipate that the guidance is likely to be updated again, although we don't know when. So it is under review. It's been updated once. Some of you will have seen that there was quite a significant shift in the tone of the guidance, whereas at first it seemed to indicate that lots of local authorities' statutory requirements could be relaxed. It no longer suggests that. It's now very clear that most statutory requirements are still required, but it is currently under review. As I said, the amendments to those regs at the moment will expire on the 25th of September. And what the guidance says in relation to the duration of these changes is that the changes will only remain in place for so long as is needed. So that gives some freedom, but it also suggests central government's thinking about whether these changes will be permanent or longer term. It doesn't seem like there's any indication of that at the moment. Now, the guidance doesn't amend either primary legislation or the statutory guidance. So the duties under the Children Act 89, 2004, and under statutory guidance are working together is the same, apart from those areas we've looked at where the amendment changes the regulations. What that means in short is that most of the expectations of local authorities have remained the same. So things like undertaking an assessment of a child in need, identifying children in need, undertaking child protection investigations, they remain the same. So as it says there, under this guidance, the majority of statutory duties are the same. They've been maintained. The guidance is very clear that even where the regulations have been amended, the relaxation should only be used where it's absolutely necessary. And in some cases, it says explicitly in the guidance, I'm sure you will have seen this, that there should be senior management oversight about using the relaxations, and they should only be used where that decision is in line with promoting the welfare of the individual child. So really clear about the process that should be gone through to introduce these relaxations and where they may be used. I think what's really helpful in the guidance is that it also says that there's an acceptance that social workers, social care practitioners may no longer be able to undertake face-to-face visits, face-to-face contact with children. That's also the case in terms of families spending time with children who are looked after. There's an acceptance that it may no longer be possible to do that face-to-face. So visits can be replaced by phone or video calls, and that is reflected in the amended regulations. There's a big focus in this guidance on local authorities, local commissioners in their area. So it delegates these decisions to you as the experts, including decisions about individual visits and whether they should be held virtually or whether it's best for them to be postponed. It introduces that flexibility. There is also guidance on the use of PEEP, which I'm sure you will have seen. It's very clear that child protection conferences should go ahead. I know this is less of what we're talking about today, but there is that information on safeguarding and reviewing serious incidents. And there's also some extra information on the issues around staffing in children's home, where there may be a shortage of foster carers and adoption panels. Now, I think the key message that I take from all of this is that the duties from primary legislation are still there in the main. There are some relaxations in those amendments to the regulations, but on the whole, the expectation is that the day-to-day work of children's social care across the country should, as far as is possible, remain what was there pre-corona, but with adaptations, which we'll talk about. There are still those expectations around assessing children's need and providing support if they are in need. That remains the same. There hasn't been changed, that fundamental expectation. But there is an understanding too that that support and the assessment might need to be delivered differently because of the circumstances we're in. I mean, that seems obvious, but it's worth saying. And I think that's particularly relevant in terms of thinking about social care's contribution to the Education, Health and Care Plan process, given that all the work we've done at CDC suggests that there's often been challenges for local areas in identifying children's social care needs, but particularly where those children haven't been known to social care. So I'm thinking about the Warwickshire judgment about where it's necessary to undertake a full Section 17 assessment and where it may be possible to hold an early help assessment instead, but also thinking about the various processes that we see across the country in terms of how local areas determine what a young person's social care need is for their education, health and care plan. And I'm saying that on the basis that we know it's not appropriate, obviously, as you will all know, to just put not known. We know that's not acceptable anymore. But there is no consensus across the country still on the best process to identify children's social care needs at the point of the Education, Health and Care Plan, the Education, Health and Care Assessment. And there are still lots of questions about who is best placed to provide the information to the EHC coordinator about that specific child's social care needs. So at CDC, we tend to say that there will be a wide range of professionals who have information about a child's social care needs and how that might relate to provision. That might be a youth worker, a drama teacher, a scout leader, and we would suggest that they could contribute to the information about the child's social care needs. Clearly there needs to be oversight from children's social care, but that those individuals could contribute, and that it's likely to be a plan that is more tailored to the child themselves if the people who know them best can contribute. And I think that might be something that should be reinforced at the moment, given that we now know it may be more difficult for somebody from social care to visit and interact with a disabled child if they haven't been known to social care before, and there may already be professionals who are working with those children who can provide lots of useful information about their social care needs. So that's just something to think about to begin with. So that's an overview of the law. I'm just checking the time, so I've got 20 minutes now. That's an overview of the law, changes that have been introduced under the amendment to the regulations, quick look at the Coronavirus Act and the implications that has, but we know that, and thinking about some of the implications for practice. What I want to do now, and it's going to have to be very quick again, is just think about some tools that might be useful for social care's contribution to the EHC process after looking at that. So the first is one of the exercises that we often do in our sessions with social care practitioners, whether it's to do with the EHC process or thinking about risk and analysis and assessment, is going right back to the beginning and enabling practitioners to really focus on individual children's fundamental needs. And what you've got on your screen now is a case study that we use as an exercise for this process in some of our sessions. And I want to show you this not because we're going to go through it and do the exercise, but so that you might be able to take this and support practitioners in your area in thinking about how they identify children's needs in these specific circumstances. And we do this exercise because often what we find is that practitioners are really able and effective at thinking about services for children, but sometimes that is 3 steps ahead, and actually where they need to begin is thinking about the real basics of the child's life and what their circumstances are and what they may need. So with Danny, what we say is, this is Danny, this is his life. Now you'll see that this is lots about risk, because actually this exercise comes from a piece of training that's really designed for child protection professionals, but I think the rules still apply. So we say, this is Danny. Look at Danny's circumstances just on this sheet of paper, that's all you've got, and begin to identify Danny's needs. So that's what the people in the room get. And what tends to happen is that when people identify need, they often jump 3 steps ahead and actually talk about provision. So you can see here what you get with this exercise is a table which uses the domains from the assessment triangle from the framework for assessing children in need along the left-hand side, with those column headings at the top. So you start off the top left with their needs. So for example, what often happens in these sessions we do is that somebody will say, Danny needs speech and language therapy. That might come under health, under his need. And we say that might be exactly the right service and provision for Danny, but it doesn't tell you anything about his need. And the need for Danny might be that he needs to be able to communicate with his carers and with his peers. And you see the difference between the service and what he needs. And there are going to be loads of basic ones, just like any other child. And I know this is like teaching somebody to suck eggs, but I think it's important to go over it. Danny needs a clean pair of clothes every day. Danny needs to be warm. He needs to be happy. He needs to be loved. And starting off at that position means, first of all the assessments that practitioners do tend to be much more closely tailored to the individual child and less generic. But also then the provision that they identify is likely to be closer to what's going to make the most difference for that child, because they've stepped back and thought about the child's needs. And it's likely then to lead to better outcomes, because you're going to be much clearer. The nature of the outcomes you're seeking for this is what they've needed. So the next step in this process is, having identified those needs, we talk about what the outcome we're looking for might be for Danny. So one of the needs that you might say is that Danny needs to be able to play. So that is his need, like any other child. And the outcome that you would see with an intervention might be, if you're trying to be very smart, is that in 3 months' time, Danny's nursery nurses will see Danny playing with his peers in his class for half an hour every day. So you can see it's very smart, and it's something you can measure. So in 3 months' time, you'd be able to check if the intervention that you'd introduced had led to that outcome, because it's very clear. And again, I think using those SMART outcomes is really useful, both as a way of measurement, but also thinking about actually what's going to change in this child's life. So thinking about at the moment, where this is useful, is I think you're able to be much more specific and focused and hone in on actually what's going to change. And if we're thinking about the limitations to services and provision at the moment, that will need to be shifted in terms of current circumstances. But I think that's a helpful way of helpful starting point. And I know that seems quite abstract at the moment, but what I have on screen now is just some suggestions, and I've adapted this from some of the Preparing for Adulthood material, so you may have seen this before, but I've made a couple of changes and I'll talk about those. So in terms of needs, outcomes, and the education, health and care plan process, and where social care might feed into this, this is a suggestion of where you might have an aspiration at the start of their plan, this young person, where this young person, who's clearly a lot older than Danny, their aspiration is to have their own flat and live in that flat with the support that they need. So I think that makes a lot of sense as an older teenager's aspiration, independence, and it reflects what they would like. And the outcomes that might link to that, where it's very specific, are things like I might have some ideas about who I want to live with by September. Bit further on, I'll have a clear idea of how I want to be supported. By September next year, this young person will be using their Monzo card when they're buying their weekly food shopping. Now, that's one of the outcomes that have shifted a little bit, because pre-corona, what that outcome would have said is, by September 2021, I'll be using both 50p and £1 coins to buy my shopping. Now, clearly, it feels like we're moving away from using cash for all sorts of reasons. And also, I think that's quite old-fashioned for lots of people, is that most people will use a card to buy their shopping. So here I'm thinking, actually, how do we enable a young person to gain those independent skills while adapting to the current circumstances, but also reflecting actually how their peers might be shopping. A Monzo card, lots of you will have a Monzo card. It allows you to put a limited amount of cash on there, and it's effectively a cash card. You use the cash on there, and then the cash is gone. So that might just be one change. Rather than using cash, it might be a Monzo card. And you can see how it's a very clear outcome. You could see this young person in September 2021 if they had achieved that outcome. The final one is, by September 2021, I'll have a clearer understanding of how to stay safe at home, online, and out and about, and they'll be able to talk about staying safe in their new home. And I think, again, the online aspect there is going to be really important, because it's likely, even when things have gone back to more normal, that we're all going to be relying on using tech more than we have before. This workshop in itself is an example of that. And young disabled people will be exactly the same. So making sure that they're safe online, I think, is a really important outcome, and that they can demonstrate they're safe online will be really crucial. So those are just some outcomes, thinking about how social care might feed into this process and how there might need to be adaptations given the current circumstances. What I also really like about the Preparing for Adulthood materials, and would recommend them, they're really useful, is that they not only provide these very clearly framed outcomes, but also talk about the steps towards those outcomes. And again, I think there's some important changes that might need to be made given the current circumstances. So you can see the outcomes that we've got here are living independently in effect, but that outcome in itself may take, on the whole, a year. So what is the smaller jump that might help a young person get to that? And how can we frame them in terms that are helpful for a young person? So one of them might be, at the moment, that this young person in 3 weeks will have looked at some types of housing online. And again, before Corona, this would have gone and visited several types of accommodation. Now, that may not be possible at the moment, so it's how can we adapt it? They will know what type of support they're entitled to when they leave education. The third one is that they'll have stayed away from home at least twice. It's a useful step towards living independently, but I put a question mark there because I wonder actually how possible that is going to be at the moment. I don't know if it's going to be possible, so that may not be realistic as a step towards the independence outcome right now. Then I will have talked to people who I'd like to live with, and I'll see if they'd like to share with me. Really important step towards the outcome, and you could measure whether that's happened. Then there's that I will have done a series of practical tasks at home around budgeting and housekeeping, and again, there might need to be changes to that in terms of budgeting, where stopping using cash, physical cash, moving on to an online account. And they'll have completed a personal safety course so that they can show they understand what to do to keep safe. And again, I think that'll be more about staying safe online. So I think what's really helpful there is thinking about starting at the top with a young person's needs, thinking about how that links to their aspirations and what the outcome you will see as a result of meeting that need. What provision can you introduce that will meet the identified need to create a better life for that young person? And how might you get there is this bit. So that's just thinking about, under the current circumstances, how might we best identify the detail for the individual sections of a young person's plan. What you have on screen now, and I'm probably 5 minutes behind, is an eco map. Now, I know lots of your practitioners will use this, and again, I'm not showing you this with the idea that we do this, but I just think as a refresher for the tools that your practitioners will have in their toolbox to help them support young people and support those young people even under the current circumstances. So eco-maps, I think, are a great tool that can be adapted to be done virtually without having to meet this young person in person. So an eco-map, in short, is the young person identifying the people and organisations that they have relationships with and what the nature of those relationships are. So for Joe, who's 14 here, you can see that his inner circle, the people who he's closest to, are his Auntie Sue, key worker Dave, and his friend Robbie. And those are the people he sees the most of, who are really helpful for him, and they're very strong relationships, which is indicated there. Then there are other organisations and people, so you can see that way out in the far corner, and that represents that this is a distant relationship because it's far away, is social services. And for Joe, that's a stressful relationship. Now, what I found useful in doing this exercise with young people in person is that you tend to be able to see the people around them who actually support them day to day when services aren't available, and you get to see the depth of their relationships, but also the diversity of people that they're able to call on when they need help, which you may not have been aware of before. So it's really a useful way for them telling you actually who can help. Sometimes you also see people that you might be more worried about, but that obviously in itself is a useful exercise. And I think when we're thinking about coronavirus and how that's affected young people, actually sitting down with them, even via a WhatsApp call, and trying to just map out who's in their network, who they use for support, who they can call on when they need a hand, particularly for older young people, is really important. And I suspect it will provide results that are a bit unexpected. And it is a way of the practitioner beginning to think about how these young people can be enabled to use their community and resources around them rather than relying on services, which in the long run is likely to be better and may be more pressing at the moment, given that there's a reduction in services. So it's thinking, well, there may be a reduction in support for this young person. Who's around? Who do they rely on anyway, who might be there to provide the stopgap? And that might provide something longer term. And it may also be a way of identifying where if one person who supports them a lot falls ill or is self-isolating, actually who else is around that might be able to step in for the interim. So it's just another tool that I think is really useful and can be very much used virtually. You could do this via a WhatsApp call and then take a photo of the eco-map and send it to the young person via WhatsApp, which might provide some really useful results. That's another tool. The final tool I'm going to show you before we have a few minutes for questions and discussions is called the Vulnerability and Resilience Matrix. But I've got this slide here first because there are some real caveats about this tool that I'm going to show you. The first one is that the language it uses is very old-fashioned and I don't like it, and I would make some adaptations to the tool itself. But the version that we have, unfortunately, uses this old language. So just hold that in mind. I didn't create this, and I'll change some of the words. But the purpose of this tool, again, is about identifying where those resources are in the community for these young people and how you might build on those resources to support young people to be more resilient so that they're less reliant on services, which again, at the moment, is clearly going to be very important. It may also be that using this tool, you actually identify that a young person is much more vulnerable than you'd thought before, and that may mean that you shift the support that you provide to this young person. You may actually think they need more services, but that in itself is helpful. So again, this is something where I think it might be useful for your practitioners to be able to access this tool and use it when they're less connected in person to the young people they're supporting, and when they're trying to think about actually how do we identify the best outcomes for these young people through the EHC process, and what might their long-term outcomes look like given their relationship in the community and the network of support around them. So in short, with this tool, what the practitioner does is they make a fairly quick judgment about the young person's resilience or vulnerability on the scale, and the scale remains the same regardless of which axes you're looking at. So let's say if the young person is very resilient, you'd mark them as a 10 and you'd plot that on that axis. If the young person lives in a very protected environment, again, you'd mark it on a 10 on that axis. If they're not very vulnerable, you might mark that as a 2 on that axis. And if there's not many adversity factors, you might mark that as a 2 again. And then you draw a line where you've plotted those points on the axes, and you'll see a diamond. Now, children who are very resilient and live in a protective environment with very few adversity factors, their diamond is going to be in the top right corner, and the opposite would be the reverse, if that makes sense. And I think what we find when we do this tool up to now, when we've used this tool up to now with practitioners, is that sometimes it gives them a very different picture of the young person's relative resilience compared to what they had in their head. So it's a useful arithmetic tool to give them a new perspective versus their gut feeling or their impression. But also it helps them think about actually how they might support and enable a young person for their diamond, if you like, to be pulled more towards the top right corner. So actually it's saying, well, I've identified through these factors that this young person is vulnerable because of X, Y, Z. How do we reduce those vulnerabilities and how do we make them more resilient? And again, thinking about where there may be fewer services, provision may not be available, there may need to be adaptation to a young person's support. That could be a really useful way of thinking, well, what needs to change in this young person's life so that they're not as reliant on service A, B, C, or what different form of service might we be able to provide that will enable this young person to be resilient in spite of what else is going on. So that's sort of 3 tools just to think about. And I'm going to come back to you now for any questions. Hopefully I can go back to the screen. This is let's do this. Yep. Go back to you, and I will send you the evaluation unless Marie already had. Yes, Marie sent you the evaluation. Any questions or comments? We've got 2 minutes. I'm really sorry that it's taken longer than I expected. So Tony's saying it feels like a bit of a contextual safeguarding approach. I think, yeah, I think the interesting thing about this is that there are some really valuable approaches from the contextual safeguarding view for all children, not just those who are at risk of exploitation. Because lots of the contextual safeguarding approach is saying, actually, how do we use a community's resource to keep children safe rather than services immediately stepping in? And sometimes that's not very helpful, but some of the time, actually, that's a really useful new perspective of thinking about what needs to change for a young person and how it may change. So yeah, I think there are some similarities. Any other questions in the 1 minute? And please do fill in that evaluation form before the end. Any other questions or comments? I think we're going to return to the main room as if we're in a room, but the main session. Any other questions or comments?
Dan, we're actually going to finish.
Oh, we're going to finish.
Yeah, we've decided that people have been really good for the last 3 hours and they probably now need a cup of tea and a lie down in a couples room. So we're not going to do a plenary. We're just going to plead with people to fill in their evaluation forms. Okay. Apologies. Right. We've kept changing things in relation to feedback. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you, everyone. Yeah, you'll get all the slides and I'll make sure that you also get the tools that I've referred to there separately, so you can print them off and hand them out or whatever you want to do with them. You'll get all of that. And please do fill in the evaluation. But thank you, everyone.
Karen Gleave is now exiting.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, Emma. Thanks for sorting that recording.
Hey, no worries. I'm going to stop the recording now, and in our the chat recording of this, there'll be all of the chat that happened on the right hand side and the video. So I'll be able to access that, but I'll find out what we have to do with it.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you were able to sort it out.
I'll sort it out, but just so you know, I've got it all there. All right.
Excellent. That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
All right, Dan. Take care. See ya.
Cheers. See you in a bit.
Bye.